Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be coming together to really dig into thinking critically about how to intentionally and equitably serve all students. My name is BB Nchaki, and I am coming from Brooklyn Laboratory Charter School. As you all just heard, school is in session. We're open in person. But we're going to hear a little bit from several organizations around how to open equitably to serve every single student. So before we sort of get going, I want you all to know who we are. My name again is BB from Brooklyn Laboratory Charter School. This session today is presented by the Super School Project, XQ. Now, XQ as an organization is fundamentally committed to ensuring that we think differently about high schools and ensure that every single learner gets the opportunity to be successful through high school design. And so the panelists we have today in this conversation will be talking a little bit about their schools and the ways in which they're driving towards that mission. My name is BB, and I'll pass it on to Eric to introduce himself and his school.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name is Eric Collazo. I'm the principal at Washington Leadership Academy in Washington, D.C. We are a single-site charter school in DC, and we predominantly serve students of color, and also we serve grades 9 through 12. One of our cool aspects is that we are one of the schools, a few schools in DC that provide a 4-year curriculum with computer science, and we definitely have a strong focus on trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, as well as just ensuring that we are addressing like the whole child as they develop from 9th grade to 12th grade as our leaders. So it's good to be here. Thanks for having me, and look forward to this conversation.
Hi, folks. My name is Lillian Sue. I'm the principal at Latitude High School in Oakland, California. We are in our 3rd year of operation and currently serving 9th through 11th graders. Our tagline is Oakland is our home, and the entire Bay Area is our extended classroom. So you can imagine how that is really operating differently right now under shelter in place. But a big part of our school is really engaging students in community connected projects, but also getting students out of the building and really seeing the entire region as their classroom and really removing the walls of the school. So excited to talk about what that's looking like right now under distance learning.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew McManus. I'm the assistant head of school at Trinity Academy for the Performing Arts, better known as TAPA. We are the newest XQ school, so we are excited to begin sharing what we do with the broader community. We're grade 7 through 12 performing arts school, serving 220 students, all from Providence, Rhode Island. And in our model, we have really placed parent involvement and clear communication at the center of our reopening plan. We've spent years building what we call the TAPA Ensemble, which is the idea that parents, the idea that students, staff, everybody in our community have equal stake in the decision-making process and all come together to make a whole for us. And in that, we've built trust. And this trust has been centered to our reopening model, which we are moving at a slightly more conservative pace than the rest of the state. But it's because our parents back what we're doing, and we're making sure that we're making students and our families feel safe with our plan.
Thank you, Andrew. So before we dig into having this conversation, I want to start off by just acknowledging that this today puts us close to 6 months out of sort of hearing about and seeing this radical transformation in schools. I remember the specific day where we made the announcement on March 17th to our family saying that schools were going to be closed. And what that fundamentally shifted was the sense of community that our children were used to. Here in Brooklyn, it meant that students didn't have a place to go to every day to engage with adults, right? It meant that they had to be at home. And so in the wake of COVID interrupting the sort of spring, there were a ton of equity concerns and issues that we faced. So I want to start the conversation there, right? When we first went into this closure in the spring, what sort of equity issues did you first encounter, and how did you respond to that? I know for us in Brooklyn Lab, one of the first things that came up where family just flagging for us, hey, before we begin to talk about schools and classroom, we just need to ensure safety, right? Borderline safety. Like, we don't want to talk about academics, we just want to make sure we are safe. And we had to like shift our model around what we were providing to families. So I want to begin first with Tapa and talk a little bit like, what equity concerns did you face going into closure?
Thank you. So for us, right at the beginning, tech and Wi-Fi needs came right to the forefront. And, you know, like most schools, that week or two leading up to that feeling that we were moving to a close, we began polling our students, and we generated a list, and we said, all right, these are the students that we know we need to get Chromebooks to the house now. We need to set them up with Wi-Fi. And what we found out was what's reported and what reality was somewhat different, and the reality was more stark and more dire. There was a feeling that, you know, we have the one phone or we have the computer in the house and that should be enough. But then once we shifted into this remote model, it became clear that houses that have parents working at home, that have multiple siblings all working on the same computer rather, that tech inequity was even greater than initially reported. So the first several months of remote learning in the spring was all about getting computers into houses, getting tech, getting Wi-Fi set up, because in order to operate this way, that's the most basic need for education. But in addition to that, food insecurity came to the forefront as well. We kept our food pantry open throughout the entire process, and we still do. We're sending out food deliveries to families and just making sure that the most basic needs are being met. We are extremely lucky to have a parent community liaison who is in constant communication with every single parent. And we're just making sure that you know, we can't even begin to think about education. We can't even dive into curriculum until we're making sure that those most basic needs are being met. And the last big thing for me, my background's in special education, and I've seen that the students that are struggling the most are students with IEPs. And for me, you know, students with organizational challenges very often have the most complicated schedules. So as a result, we've really made sure to dive in, call, text every single day, tap into paraprofessionals and just say, your main job today is just to get this student awake into class. And we've been creating hyper individualized schedules for them, all the way down to having hyperlinks that click right to where they need to go. But for me, it makes me think broader and long-term that, is it really fair that the schedules for these students are the most complicated ones, and how can we remedy that over time?
As you were speaking, one thing that just sort of lit up for me is this idea of students' lived experiences, right? When we went into the closure, I remember trying to have meetings, and I would hear the sort of ambulances going back and forth, and I'm like, I couldn't even focus as an adult, right? And so I was just wondering, like, what sort of interruptions are students experiencing? I would love to hear a little bit more from, you know, nation's capital, right? What sort of concerns did you experience? And then we'll pass it on after you to Lily.
I think, like, I agree wholeheartedly with like some of the instances that was mentioned just prior. Definitely the whole idea of tech, definitely the whole idea of food insecurity. I think one of the other key things to mention too that we felt specifically was the idea that it hit our specific parents and family members more harshly, because we dealt with parents of color. We dealt with parents that are in food and service industries, within healthcare industries, and they were the ones that are primarily getting exposed more often to the, you know, circumstances of COVID. And I think one of the key things that we had to do was the idea of providing mental health services for our students and for our families. So thankfully, we've invested in some really strong counselors and having multiple counselors per grade, and they came together. Our wellness team was able to provide services for both families, for students. Make sure they have regular check-ins, but like our mental health of our students was definitely a concern. They were worried about parents being sick. They were worried about elderly, you know, their grandparents being sick. They were taking care of them at times. We've had instances where kids were becoming pretty much the main adult in the actual, you know, apartment or home, because now their parent is sick and they had to take care of their siblings. They had to take care of their elderly, you know, grandparents. And that was one of the key things that we had to make sure we focus on, is like just the mental health and wellness of our kids. So along with safety, along with food insecurity, and along with like technology needs, the mental health was definitely an aspect that we needed to hit. And thankfully we were able to invest in that early.
Yeah, I think my experience out here in Oakland, the way that one of our staff members who lives in East Oakland described it is that for a lot of our students, the sheltering in place is like living inside of a box, inside of another box. And because for a lot of our kiddos, they actually are sheltering in place. They rent a room within a larger house, right? And so they're not just sheltering in place in one building, they're actually sheltering in place in one small room within the larger home, right? So I think that just the mental health piece of the sheltering in place and being sort of confined to these really small spaces was incredibly challenging. And I think that for us, I think the other piece of it is just what supports that the students had at home to really support them through distance learning, or what other responsibilities our students were really responsible for. So a lot of our high schoolers are also taking care of younger siblings, and because they're the only one in the home who can navigate a lot of the online technologies, they're helping their younger siblings to really manage day-to-day distance learning while also managing their own education. And I think that the other big piece of it is who's there or who's not there to really support them in kind of keeping on top of their schedule. So for our community, one thing that we decided really early on in week one was that we would have an attendance team on standby within the first 5 minutes of every class. If a student is missing, we're immediately on the phone calling the student and saying, hey, did you oversleep? Are you having a tech issue? Is there some larger piece that's going on? And so just like making that determination that we weren't going to really put it on the families to be the ones to make sure students got on the computer each day, that we as the team really had to take on that responsibility. So those are some of the kind of key equity pieces that rose to the forefront, in addition to some of the mental health pieces that Eric spoke to.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about, our community, the way we've committed to ensuring that every student succeeds, right? A part of that is also how we do it, right? The way and the process in which we attempt to reach equity. One of the things that in my own school, I realized is sort of how do we actually also take care of our people so that they can take care of the children and the families. And so we began to really go through a series of like testing and failing a lot, right? And I would love to, in this sort of moment, just share some of the things that have worked well for you and some of the things that you're struggling. We are currently really struggling with trying to really get our seniors, right, to be engaged in ways that we were used to before closure, right? So our seniors are in a position now where they're thinking around issues like voting, and they're thinking about the fact that they're 7 months out of, being out of high school, and this is their final year. This is our first graduating class. And so for them, they're sort of like in a place where they're just like, tell me the thing that you need me to do, because I have a range of responsibilities that, makes being in school that much more difficult. So one of the things that has worked for us has been this idea of success coaching, right? And success coaching is a protocol where every senior and actually every high schooler has a single adult, right? What we realized very quickly, returning to school, is that typically most families have 6 people to call to, right? You have the tech team, you have the teaching team, you have the principal's number, and it's a lot of people to reach out to. So we really thought about this notion that what if you had one person and that person was your school? So whatever the concern or the issue, you would reach out to this person, and this person's responsibility was to meet that need, right? And so that's one thing that has been working well for us, in the sense that I know if there's an issue going on with Niasia, right, her success coach is Mr. Harcourt, right? And he's the person who's responsible for that family. But one area that we are struggling right now is really maintaining and establishing new relationships, right? As we've gone remote, our scholars are saying, hey, who are these people out in this, new learning environment, right? So there are challenges there, and we're trying to figure it out, right? We haven't been successful with that, but we have found some success in sort of narrowing down the number of people that a family is engaging with. What we realize is that families also share with us, we don't want to tell 6 different people what's going on with us, right? Like, we don't want to keep repeating those things. And so for our end, that's one thing that's working well. And I would love to hear from you all. What are some of the tactics and things you're doing that is going really well?
Yeah, BB, I can build on that because I think we're following a similar model. So I think knowing that we were going to be starting the year in distance learning, we decided to have our advisory sizes this year. And so in the past, we had 2 advisors for a larger group of 20. And this for this year, we decided we were going to split that in half so that each advisor had between kind of 8 to 10 students that they were really responsible for. And we have dedicated time carved out on Mondays each week where the advisors are actually reaching out to families. And in my week ahead email, I put in the latest stats around like, hey, these are the students who were tardy last week, who are sort of at the top of our list. These are the students who were most frequently unresponsive during class last week, right? And so Mondays, there's dedicated time for the advisors to get on the phone and call those families and talk to them and try to unpack what's going on and problem solve together, right? So I think those smaller cohorts and the fact that every student has a dedicated adult who really is knows that it's kind of their mission this fall to really make sure that student doesn't fall through the cracks and is the main lifeline and liaison to the family. I think that's been really crucial. And I think that we also changed up our advisory structure this fall. We used to have single grade level advisories, and knowing that we were going to start the year completely remote and that we'd be welcoming in a brand new group of 9th graders who've never met anyone in person before, we decided to really switch over to doing multi-grade level advisories so that the sophomores and juniors could take on kind of a mentorship and leadership role in welcoming in the new 9th graders, right? So I think leveraging the advisory model in ways that in even more intense ways than we have before, but then also leveraging the multi-grade level groupings. I think those are some of the pieces that have really worked well for us. In terms of areas we're struggling in, I think it's still really hard in terms of, I think, our breakout spaces, right? Like we purposely moved from doing Google Hangouts to Zoom because our teachers were so excited to leverage the breakout room feature of Zoom. But because of internet lag, right? I think our goal had been like, everybody's gonna have their screens on and we're gonna have these rich discussions and like fun social groups. But I think because like, even though 100% of our students like have a hotspot if they need it and have Wi-Fi, like the lag time of it and just the slowness of the internet results in some students not always having their screens on, right? And so making those breakout spaces like really beautiful, rich, juicy discussion and social connection spaces is something that we're really still working on.
I can build off of that too. I definitely want to give the +1 for the advisories. That's definitely been something that's been really helpful in feeling like kids can still connect. I think one of the things that kids are craving right now, at least like high schoolers, is that they miss that connection with other kids and even the adults that they are close to. So one of the things that I think has been working well is as we've been devising different types of activities and events that can take place that kind of bring that sense of community and build that sense of community even though we're apart. So we've done things like, we'll do things like multi-grade level town halls so that people are getting interaction between different grade levels. As we were noticing initially that there was a lot of separation and we're able to actually interact with each other. We've also done things that we have advisory houses, kind of similar to like how Harry Potter is. And what we've done now, we do house games. So we'll do like different like Kahoots or different, we'll do like name that tunes where we play a portion of a song, they have to identify it and then they get points. And it builds this sense of community and like they actually have this sense of like, oh, there's something to look forward to. There's some kind of fun aspect to not just the Zoom and learning component, which obviously is important, but these are the things that make people tied to a community. Like we actually interact with our peers. We get to actually feel like we're on a team. So we've done that. And I think that's been really successful. And it's made kids feel like this is the actual school part. It's not just the academics, it's actually the connections and community part too. Something else that we've done as well is to, again, build that community is we've incorporated extracurriculars where possible. So any extracurriculars that could be adapted into a virtual setting, we've been able to change into like a actual regular meeting time where they still meet after school. They have these extracurriculars. So right now they're working on virtual theater production. They have an online video gaming club, which was obviously that could work automatically. So that was something that they're doing. And even stuff like virtual music production and things like that. So giving kids that outlet, because kind of like what Lillian was saying before, they're really feeling limited in what they can do, being cramped up in their home or not being able to go outside and do things that they would normally do. So like these outlets have been really positive for kids, and like they feel like now they're more tied to it, especially for our ninth graders that are just new to WLA. It's a way that they've been able to connect now. They've been able to actually learn other folks in the school, learn about other teachers, learn about other peers. So I would say what's been really helpful is just building that sense of community among our folks through these different events. An area that we've been like, I think, struggling and still trying to like manage and learn how to adapt is this idea of like what makes the most sense curriculum wise when instructing and when it comes to focusing on our academics. One of the key things that I think teachers have been feeling the pressure of is like, hey, we have to get through a certain curriculum. We're starting this year out virtually, and right now we're continuing to virtually at least January. And it's like, how are we going to be able to hit those target things that we need to hit within our curriculum pacing guide in the right order, in the right time span, so that kids aren't falling behind. I think one of the things that we had to come to terms with is that, like right now, what makes the most sense is we need to focus on depth rather than breadth, and just making sure that the type of lessons that we're giving and delivering to our students have a lot of quality in it and actually focus on the actual mastery of a standard rather than simply covering different skills before and then moving on to the next. So that's been a mindset shift because, obviously folks feel like there's pressures to still stick to what the pacing guide was originally in their curriculum, or even just like, what does our accountability look like with like national testing and things of that nature. But we've been having to navigate that space and trying to work with our teachers to just focus on that mastery component, focus on kids actually getting these skills and standards, and then moving on to the next, even if it means sacrificing a little bit of pace. But that's definitely been an area where we've been trying to like navigate and learn a little bit more about.
BB talked about testing and failing, and that resonated quite a bit. For us in the spring, we adopted an asynchronous model fully, which has its pros and cons. I mean, for us, we were able to organize some great work into the Google Classroom spaces, but not having that structured start and end time to the day did start to wear on students and staff alike. It started feeling like school was 20 hours long and things were getting handed in at all times. And aspects of it just felt unsustainable. So as we took the summer and shifted into the new year, we set a more structured synchronous schedule for our students. And even the asynchronous times that we've built in, so we have social emotional blocks, we have times for just getting your homework done that are built into the schedule. But even that is structured. Like even the time for when that takes place is a little bit more structured so that the students know where it is. And something that we added to the schedule that, I feel like we're in the just ending the testing phase and really hoping to expand it more is we put in these office hours times on Tuesdays and Thursdays that can allow for some one-to-one interaction between students and teachers. That is currently lacking in the model. It has the most potential. It had a slow start, but with some pushes from our advisors, and I already heard a +1 for advisory. I'm going to +2 or +3. I don't know where we're at, but really building on that advisory piece to advocate for the student to attend a certain office hour. I have found that this shift into remote learning has brought upon the rebirth of the advisor in a way. For many people, advisory, everyone felt close to their advisory, and it was a little more than a homeroom. It wasn't just time to hang out, but I think that it's made that leap into the champion status where every advisor does feel that they need to be the main advocate for their advisee, and that's how we on the administrative side, and that's how us on the social emotional team have really been able to find out food needs, tech needs, housing needs faster. Is through that advisory piece. So that's been a strength that's worked particularly well. I echo the struggles are in peer interaction. I still feel like that's a piece that's missing. what Eric's doing at Washington Leadership is what we're aiming to start doing, which is opening up spaces just for clubs and for normal peer interaction that's non-academic. The other area that we're struggling in, and I know that other schools are too, because all of the people on this panel we talked before, is the camera and how to handle that in distance learning. There's a big discussion to be had about having the camera off on one side because not wanting to allow in what's going on at the home or not feeling comfort with that, but also really feeling that having that camera off is hurting engagement and making it so that we're not necessarily connecting with the students. So that's an area we're still struggling in and are open to suggestions and comments in the chat bar over how to best handle. But I think that for us, I think for most school leaders that they're tackling these same issues. And that's why the three of us or the four of us all said close to the same thing. And my suggestion is talking to other school leaders, because before meeting with BB and Lillian and Eric, I think that our school leadership team wondered if we were struggling with this alone, but really they're common issues across the country.
You are not alone in this. We are all trying to learn and get it right for children. I think one place that, as you were speaking, just resonated with me is this idea of a vision for student success, right? There was a world where we had a vision before we went into the pandemic, and not to mention, the past, this summer, right? A lot happened in the news around civic engagements and movements that scholars were bringing into this new learning environment. So now I'm really beginning to ask the question, right? For most schools, you're either in your first sort of quarter or coming to the end of that and looking forward into what's next, right? And so I think as a final question, I would love to engage folks on this call too here, is that what system do you really plan on employing to ensure that the places where you've seen equity established continues to be maintained, right? You named the virtual and physical space. We have scholars who are incredibly strong at navigating, this piece of technology in their hand, right? They figure this out. And then you have those who learn differently, right? We at Brooklyn Laboratory Charter School, we serve complex learners whose learning process includes things like reading facial cues and the physicality of having to type responses and sort of speak out in responding to questions. Those are things that can become real barriers to entry towards a great and strong education. So one of the things we are really beginning to think about as a system to continue implementing is we can't do this alone, right? So Brooklyn Lab has said, we said, hey, what if we continue to engage organizations that are doing and focused on aspects of the challenges we're having? So we've engaged in a set of design charrettes around facilities. How do you safely open a building? We've engaged around things like success coaching. And now we're really looking at agency in the virtual and physical space, right? How do we get students to be able to actually say, hey, I'm actually not okay with this way of communication, right? It's disruptive to my living environment, right? So how do we actually listen in and sort of solicit more authentic student understandings and needs so that we can meet them? I know this is a very big question, but I would love to hear sort of how are you thinking about maintaining equity in the virtual and physical space? Let's see. Okay, so I think we can start here. Lily, some of the things you said have been really powerful, so let's start with you.
Sure. So I think that this pandemic has forced us to be a lot more systematic in terms of really inquiring from our students and families, like what's happening in terms of mental health in the home, in terms of food resources, in terms of rent, right? And so on the first day of school, we gave out to all students a survey that kind of asked a lot of those questions in detail so that we could quickly triage and figure out, how we could get resources to the right families. And we've been trying to be really systematic where we're kind of checking in and updating those surveys every month so that if needs have changed, we're able to make sure that it's not just the most vocal students who are speaking up that are getting the resources, but that we're really looking at every single student and family and understanding understanding how the home environment might be shifting, and therefore like what we need to adjust in terms of, you know, where we're putting our mental health resources, as well as like the money that we're able to raise to go towards groceries or helping to pay rent, right? So I think those are, so I think that piece has actually been really eye-opening. I think we always knew that Oakland was economically stratified, right? We have some really wealthy folks in the city, and there's also still a lot of really deep poverty in our city. And the fact that we've been doing home deliveries has actually, like in the course of one day, we're traveling to like, you know, many different homes across the city and seeing the kind of really big disparity in terms of the home environments that our students are currently sheltering in place in. So I think that it's just opened our eyes even more to really recognizing that our students are coming from really different circumstances, and that we need to make sure that we're being systematic in making those inquiries, but then also having kind of the resources in place to be able to deploy them as needed. So that would be one piece I would say. I think the other piece I would say that we are really working on in the virtual space is also how do we maintain a sense of hopefulness and purpose during this time, right? And I think for us, so a big part of our model when we were in person was getting kids out into the community, visiting different workplaces, exploring the anthropology of different jobs. And I think now in the virtual space, that's harder, but we've been bringing folks in to do inspiration interviews through Zoom. And we're also restarting a lot of the nature work that we've been doing. And we just finished doing a camping trip. We had really different safety protocols, every kid in their own tent, right? And mountain biking. But we are seeing that those opportunities to get out into nature and to kind of be connected in those ways has been so crucial for our students' mental health during this time. And so those are some of the pieces that, you know, whether we stay virtual for the rest of this year or we are able to get back in some hybrid mode, we're really wanting to maintain.
Yeah, I think for us, just echoing a common theme throughout this is that I think that we've recognized and hope to make permanent the greater value of the advisory role within the school. We've really shifted our expectation that the advisor's role is on an equal plane to their role as an educator. And by doing that, we've been able to really make sure that communication stays active. Our phone is our friend. And during this pandemic, we've had to do calls and texts and emails constantly, and we need to loop in advisors throughout the whole process. And I'm not sure that's something we were fully doing before, but I think now we know that whenever there's a student concern that arises at any level, so whether it's picked up by the social worker, whether it's picked up by the administrative team or whoever, we need to get that advisor involved right away. So this pandemic has forced us to pause and really re-examine and amplify the role of the advisor. We're lucky enough that we have a dean of students at our school that will put in 100, 200 phone calls a day if that's what's necessary to get a kid to class. But I do think that we can further tap the advisors to help that one dean of students to be able to make sure that those communications between home and the school stay as active as they have been throughout the pandemic. And also, we've been doing a lot of polls and data collection with the students that is not as a practice that we do need to maintain. So we've been making sure that on a monthly basis and throughout the summer, we were either doing focus groups or we were sending out literal Google polls just to tap into seeing what's going on with the students so that we can utilize their input in our decision making as well. And that's a practice that I hope and I will work to see maintained in our physical space as we move forward.
Definitely props to you for that, Dean, man. One of the things I found encouraging is that like folks are really like in this time, folks are really willing to just do whatever it takes to make sure that kids are successful. And I think that's what I want to chime in and say is like here in this situation where we're at, you know, everybody uses the word unprecedented and this is uncharted territory. It is. I think one of the key things that's like that helps us at WLA make sure that we're continuing systems of equity is like kind of like what we've heard from other folks here too, is that like we've incorporated our stakeholders' voice. And I think what's important here is to empathize with those that you're serving, especially those that are the most marginalized. So as we're planning and as we're devising what the next steps are or the next model of implementation is, we've incorporated that direct feedback. We've done surveys for, you know, families, for students, from teachers, staff members. We've made sure to have open door sessions so that people can communicate how they're actually feeling. Advisors are an integral role in making sure they're actually doing that, connecting with a student to see like, how are you doing? what kind of feedback do you have for us? And taking that feedback seriously and implementing it. I think one of the key things like moving forward for us is like, as we continue to iterate and move forward, like what our implementation was back in March is totally different than what we are at in interim 1 at WLA. And we're making further improvements and further modifications in interim 2 that's coming up in about a week. So one of the key things, just like considering for everyone, is just to know that it's been a really important aspect for parents and students and teachers to feel a part of this community and the decision making, and just to keep that at the forefront as you're planning and trying to figure out what the next best steps are for your organization. It helps when people feel like they're part of the team. It helps when people feel like we're in this together. As Andrew was saying before, like sometimes it feels like you may be like struggling or suffering alone, but when you start to actually connect with others and start to game plan and put your brains together, that really helps. So I just want to say that is that my takeaway for making sure that systems of equity are in place is making sure we're empathizing, incorporating everyone's voice, and also maintaining flexibility. That yes, we may have implemented something that was more effective than the last version, but it doesn't mean that further improvements can be made as we continue to navigate this, quote unquote, unprecedented and uncharted territory.
Yeah, I always come back to one of the first questions that our families they've started to ask us, right? And it's interesting because we've sort of grown with our families. So families are asking like, hey, how are you doing? Like, how are you the educator? How are you doing, right? From a space of really beginning to think about like, schools are forever changed, right? And when we look at our 9th graders who are starting high school in this world, it means some very, very specific things about how they experience learning year in, year out, And so one of the goals that we wanted folks who are on this call to leave with are very specific things they can try out, right? These are, again, examples, not exemplars, right? Because we've tried them out and we want to be able to name, from an equity perspective, the one thing we're committed to doing, to saying, what is the thing we're using to measure whether or not we're hitting our equity bar? And so I'm going to first share for Brooklyn Lab, one of the things that we've really prioritized around really doing school differently. And that will sort of add to my closing comments. And I would love to really dig into questions if folks have them. So the first piece that we're now every single day thinking about is, what did we do well with children today? Right? It's a very different metric, right? And when we ask that question, what we mean by that is, where students able to learn and where's the evidence of that learning, right? And so you hear a range of things. Folks come in and they go, hey, today this 10th grader told us that they can now do X, right? And so we're really starting to collect those evidence of learning and are asking ourselves, are those the things that as a school, in terms of our mission, that we're driving after, right? Because we have to think differently about where kids are, what their experiences are, and how they're experiencing us in this moment. For us, equity specifically means focusing on social emotional wellness, right? That's what it means right now. It's not about how many standards do we hit today. It's really about that. A second part of what we're doing now is we're asking students what's going on around them. Our families, of course, are always apprehensive about where this information is going. And so we always start off by saying to a family, how can we be helpful, right? That's a question we're asking. What can we do as a school community to be helpful? And that is really changing the nature of the relationship between our school community and our families. And so I want to do one final round from you all. What is the one thing you're doing as a school to say, this is the thing we're driving after or checking ourselves against when it comes to equity? And let's start with you, Lillian, and we'll jump to Andrew and Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it goes back to what does it mean to be human during this moment in time, right? And how are we tending to hopefulness, purpose, and joy with our students first and foremost, right? And I always go back to Margaret Wheatley's like above the green line and below the green line model. And I think we talked a lot about a lot of the technical pieces today about what we're trying by way of implementation, but really it's all founded on those relationships and on those pieces around meaning making and purpose, right? So I think that is what I keep coming back to is like, as a community, how are we always tending to that? How are we in sort of framing for students why we're doing what we're doing? How are we in the way in every interaction that we have with kids? How are we really tending to that sense of connectedness, belonging, hope, purpose, and joy?
I think for us, what's been really helpful for us to just consider if students, like how students are doing and how if they're doing well. There's been like a lot of transparency in this moment. I think one of the key things that I'm taking away from quick context here. So I stepped into the principal role back in November 2019, and soon after COVID hit. So this has been a new experience for me, period, just leading a school. But one of the key things that I'm doing here is also reaching out. And I think people really appreciate, especially during this time where like connection isn't necessarily a thing that we can do in person for the most part, but they're appreciating the sense of transparency and willingness to be brought on board as part of the community. It's funny, but at least parents and students are starting to feel like actually WLA feels more like a community now than it was before because of how much we've been doing to ask that question, like Lillian said, like, how are you doing as a human? So I would say just like moving forward as you guys consider like what the next steps are and like thinking about, you know, how we deal with remote learning, how we deal with hybrid is to continue to reach out, continue to connect in the best ways that you can, because people appreciate that sense of transparency and that sense of like being on board with the team. And it's made the world a difference for us because now also like what Bibi was saying is that now parents and family members are starting to pick up on that, as well as that we ask them these questions and they're starting to check in on us too. They're starting to actually have concern for us. And to be honest, that's been a world of difference now because we all feel like, yes, this is hard. This is not the easiest thing we've ever been through. But by us having these small moments of just checking in with each other, it makes it a little bit easier, a little more tolerable, and it makes us feel like, yeah, we're all in this in the same way. So that's my little thing. I think that people should just continue to reach out, continue to connect, and be as transparent as possible about how difficult this is so that people can give their input and help you out as well.
I'd echo the transparency piece and I'd echo the communication piece as being essential and critical right now, but also needs to become permanent practice. I think that it was easy in the past to think that just sending a quick email out might be enough. And I think that it's clear that you need to utilize multiple modes of communication to really make sure that you're hearing everybody's voice. So if you're not opening up the forums for a group meeting, or if you're not putting in the phone calls, then you are just simply not able to reach everybody. Because if we found out anything in March, it's that they might not get that email because they might not have Wi-Fi. And there's just, if you are not hearing from a family, you need to figure out the way to get to them. It is not saying like, well, I emailed them like 20 times and they never responded. It's like, then stop emailing. There's another approach. And I think that the way that we're going to continue to maintain and build trust with our community is by putting out the multiple forums to be heard. Because it's not just about us delivering information. We need to make sure that we're putting out the forums that allow us to hear our community.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. One thing that I think we should definitely share with this group here is there's a range of resources that we're going to be sharing at the end of this. And so I just want to double click on one that I will guide people to. And I know you will have that resource that has been helpful to your process and your journey. For our school, a useful resource that we're going to be sharing out is the Success Coaching Playbook. And it's a playbook that lays out what success coaching is, how to implement it, and also some of the problems that you're going to run into and some of the solutions we've come up with. So you will be receiving that Success Coaching Playbook at the end of this session in the resources. But you're going to get a lot of things. When you see Brooklyn Lab, I invite you to quickly jump into that Success Coaching Playbook as a way to begin building relationships. And for the rest of the folks on this call, what is the one resource you would like to draw people's attention to? I ask that question because we are, at this point, bombarded with so much, right? Each day, you're getting a lot of things and you're asking yourself, what is the one thing I should look at, right? If there's one thing I need to look at, what would that be for your school to the rest of this group? So let's start with you, Eric, and then we'll go to Lydia and go to Andrew.
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the key things that I've been looking at in terms of like resources, this is kind of like, I mean, not necessarily like a direct resource I was able to say to share, but my thing has been developing a strong cohort of leaders in DC. And now that's been my sounding board. So I would say like for like making sure that like whatever role that you're in, have a collective that you can go to get that sounding board and to get multiple perspectives before you start to implement or have a question or a challenge that you need to address. Like, I think even before COVID, this wasn't necessarily as strong of a thing as now, where I literally will reach out to 5 other principals within the District of Columbia and like, hey, you know, are you experiencing these same challenges? What do you think about this? How are you implementing this? And that sounding board has been invaluable to making sure that we make sound decisions. And also, again, kind of like with that theme we heard before, where we're not suffering through this alone. People are experiencing the same kind of challenges. So I'd say resource-wise, for me, the biggest thing is like creating that cohort of people that you can trust and have that sounding board, and let that be the driver for when you start making initial decisions.
For us at Latitude, I'm happy to share the process we've been doing with our inspiration interviews. I think that's been a real joy for us that our students and our staff look forward to as part of our extended advisories. And so how have we set those up? How have we kind of recruited a wide variety of interviewees to match with each student in terms of their career interests? And then how do we kind of leverage those opportunities so that the students get the most out of those experiences, and then follow up and close the loop with those community partners? So the fact that you can still do kind of community connections during distance learning, happy to share our resources on that.
I think for us, I'd point people to the parent resources page on our TAPA website. We've done a pretty great job, mostly led by our family community liaison and our academic dean, just making sure that information gets sent out in English and Spanish, but then is permanently archived and documented. So when you go to that site, you can find all the communication running backwards from the beginning of COVID. So it's not like, there's no need to scramble to find information. We've really created a central warehouse for all of the information that we've been putting out to families. We got into the practice in the spring of also setting out videos as well. We've done that a few times in the fall, and maybe it's a practice to bring back, but we also make sure to archive and document that there. And just create one central location that you can always point family and community towards, rather than having to run backwards in emails, because everyone gets a lot of emails. So it's better to have it in one spot like that. So I'd point people there for exemplars on communication tools.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as promised, we did want to make this a conversation. And so just looking through the chat to see questions from folks on this call. And so let's see what we have here. There's a question here from Camille Kerr. The question is, how have you managed student behavior? That's a good question. How have you managed student behavior? I think, so I can sort of start in terms of Brooklyn Lab, how we've managed behavior. So we began to think about behavior a little differently in the remote world. We've started to think of it more as, what is the behavior telling us about who we need to be as a school, right? And so just to be very explicit in terms of what that means, is that if a student, for example, is in a Zoom session, right? We think of it in a way we would think, previously, as in they didn't show up to class. We don't take a punitive approach, right? We say, okay, if the student is not here, they're clearly somewhere else, right? So where is that place? Did we get the information to them? We've moved very, very significantly away from any system that sort of tracks misbehaviors. And we think of it more as, where are the places that we're not showing up for that scholar, right? So if attendance is an issue, that's on us to figure it out. If a student is not completing work, right, that's a very specific example. I think recently the DOE just put out correspondence that says the idea of a deadline being punitive if a kid doesn't show up is not okay. And from an equity lenses, that's an approach that we're taking as a school to say, how do we understand the student's experience to create learning for them, right? So it's student first in that way. And every behavior we connected to a resource that can support that behavior be both healthy and safe, right? And so that's how we're approaching it. I would love to hear from you all. I know we have a few moments here before we wrap up, but how are you all thinking about student behavior?
Yeah, I think Because we're 100% online right now, the biggest challenge we run into is when students are unresponsive during a Zoom call, right? They're logged in, but if they are called on to kind of be part of a discussion or to join a breakout room and they're unresponsive, then sometimes we don't know why, right? And so I think that that's been our biggest piece, is that we leverage Slack as a communication tool, and that's been invaluable. So if a student is unresponsive in class, they will Slack the student to the unresponsive channel, and then I will tag the advisor. And the advisor during that day, during advisory, will actually have a conversation with that student. And there's like, hey, what was going on? Did something come up, or are you just not feeling it in that class? Like, what's happening? And so I think that I would say the biggest piece right now is not making assumptions about why a student might not be engaging, and really carving out dedicated space and having there be a point person who can follow up with that student to really try to unpack what's going on and figure out next steps.
For us, I mean, kind of similar to what Lillian is saying, we're fully virtual, so behavior necessarily hasn't been a major issue, thankfully. But we have noticed one of our things is, again, engagement. So like when students are not attending or just not being responsive. And what we started incorporating with our deans is what we call fresh checks.